Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing undoubtedly the most famous of all of Osamu Tezuka's works, Astro Boy. Now, I'm sure that everyone who's watching this video has probably heard of Astro Boy in some shape or form. Probably not necessarily of the creator though, Osamu Tezuka. So basically, Osamu Tezuka, he's considered the god of manga. In his lifetime, he created over 750 volumes of manga, which translates to about 150,000 pages. Not only that, he did over 80 animated TV series and films. So undoubtedly, he is one of the most influential, if not the most influential people in the mediums of manga and anime. He is hugely influential, and this is his most famous work. So let's start off with the story. What is the story of Astro Boy? Basically, it opens up with a boy called Tobio dying in a car crash. And his father, Dr. Tenma, who's also the head of the Ministry of Science, is very distressed and upset about this, of course. And so he decides in his grief to create a robot that is visually identical to his son, and will also be one of the most advanced robots in the world in both power, like he has 100,000 horsepower, and also emotion. He'll be able to actually be emotional, to empathize. He will feel what humans feel. And so once he has created that robot, for a while Dr. Tenma's happy, but after a while he realizes that this boy won't grow because he's a robot. And he gets upset about this. He decides to sell him to a troop master of a circus. And this other scientist, Ochanomizu, finds Astro working at this circus and realizes that this robot is far more advanced and he should not be, being used at a circus. So he takes him out of the circus, gives him a robot family, and that's how the story of Astro begins. Now, there's a couple of things I need to point out about the stories of Astro. So the very first thing I should mention is the chronology of this. These stories aren't told in a chronological order. Basically, the stories of Astro Boy weren't compiled into tankobon format until around 1975, but the first Astro Boy stories were actually beginning around 1951, 1952, so there were a huge amount of stories developed by that point, by 1975. And Osamu Tezuka, he decided to order them for these releases, and as far as I can tell, I might be wrong on this, but as far as I can tell, the entire order of this was simply that he wanted to put several of his favorite stories near the beginning. That and page count, or so essentially around 200 pages per release. So there are a couple of issues that I have with this order that he created. The very first thing that I have an issue with is to do with the horsepower of Astro. So basically, Astro begins the story with 100,000 horsepower, but around a certain point, a famous story, The Greatest Robot on Earth, brings his horsepower up to 1,000,000. And I just find it a bit awkward that you're going between certain stories and switching between 100,000 or 1,000,000, because he's also fighting against the robots, and you're kind of going in certain stories, this robot's so intimidating. It's like 90,000 horsepower, 100,000 horsepower, maybe even 120,000 horsepower. And then you move on to another story and it's like, oh, this robot that he's fighting now is 1.2 million horsepower. I'm kind of thinking to myself, why didn't these million horsepower robots show up when he had 100,000 horsepower? It just feels a bit strange, I should say, when it comes to that. I guess I think people would kind of, who've read Dragon Ball, would kind of relate with that kind of a sense of scale. Like, it just doesn't feel kind of right. And the other thing I should mention is the theme of robot rights. Basically, throughout the entire story of Astro Boy, there is the theme of, what rights do robots have? Should they be equal to humans? Should they not be allowed to do certain things? And basically, robots are treated more abusively in the 1950s Astro Boy stories, as well as some of the earlier 1960s stories. And around the late 1960s, early 1970s stories, the robot rights situation kind of starts to develop more, and feels like there's progression on that front. But I do find it kind of annoying that, say there's like a big breakthrough for robot rights, and then you move on to the next story and it's back to the beginning again, like, robots are being treated abusively. So I just found that a little irritating. So yeah, that's my opinion on the kind of chronology of Astro Boy. Now, to do with the actual stories themselves, they are generally episodic. There are a couple of stories that feed into each other, but in general they're standalone. And I would say that they are quite uneven sometimes. I mean, we get stories ranging from robot rights to, you know, Astro simply having to fight robots and aliens. And I will say that the more interesting ones I generally found were the robot rights ones. Now, I did find some of the shorter fighting Astro Boy stories to be interesting, but generally I found them to be just a bit too, you know, fluff. So yeah, I will say that in general the stories are a bit of an uneven quality. I will say there was never a story that I hated, but there were like stories that I just found kind of uninteresting and bland. But even Osamu Tezuka himself says that near the beginning. So I did find that a bit, you know, awkward. But in general, you know, I did enjoy many of the stories of Astro Boy, particularly near the end of the story. Like the some of the stories that Osamu Tezuka himself wasn't keen on, actually found really engaging because they dealt with a lot of dark themes. In particular, two that I remember were a story where this robot, I think he was called the Blue Knight, was trying to create a robot nation. And this other one as well, the end of Astro Boy, was a really dark, but really interesting story. So I really like those stories. Dark stories and stories to do with robot rights were generally the ones that did it for me. So I would say uneven quality, but in general I enjoyed it. The art of Astro Boy varies enormously, as you can imagine. There were stories being done in the 80s and stories being done in the 50s. So I will say the biggest thing for me to do with the earlier Astro Boy stories was that they had a lot of frames, a lot of panels, which you can see in this. This is actually from the very first Astro Boy story. And you'll see there are a lot of panels on each page, like around 9 on this page, around 9 on the... So in general, around 9 panels a page. And then you move on to some of the later stories, and you can see that there's a lot more kind of breathing room, a lot more space. So I will say that, of course, the quality of the art does improve over time, to do with paneling and to do with the actual look of the series. But I will say that there are some like earlier stories that are very appealing in their visual designs. It's just the smaller panels I'll get onto in a moment, discussing Dark Horse's treatment of it. And the actual look of the series is very clean. To do with like the gothic science fiction look is very nice. In fact, it impressed Stanley Kubrick so much that he wanted Osamu Tezuka to be the art designer for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which Osamu Tezuka declined. So basically the visual look of it is very good. And also I love the cartoony look of it. It's very Disney influenced, as you can imagine. But that really does have an appeal. That old cartoony look really is appealing. And to deal with maybe Dark Horse's treatment of this series, in these editions at least, I will talk about some other editions that are coming out later. Basically these are pretty small. So if I get my Yotsuba, which is a standard tankobon size, you'll see that a standard Astro Boy thing is this. It's actually smaller. Which I did find a bit awkward, particularly to do with those earlier stories, with the smaller panels. It meant that I kind of had to squint for some of them and made my eyes uncomfortable. So I'm hoping that a Dark Horse in their upcoming release will make the trim size bigger, just so that those earlier stories have a bit more room to breathe, because I will say those early stories do feel a bit uncomfortable reads simply because of how small the release is and how small a lot of the panels are. Translation-wise, this was done by Frederick L. Short, who was a friend of Osamu Tezuka and a very talented translator. And in general, the translation stuff is really good. The biggest issue I have with the translation is that there are a lot of grammatical errors, like words kind of repeating or just incorrect grammar. It just that does take you a bit out of the story. And there's a lot more that you expect in a lot of manga series to come across a couple of them, but in general there was actually a good few in each volume. So I did find that quite awkward, and I hope that Dark Horse correct it, although I do know that there are some politics about having to correct translations. In general, the paper quality is pretty good. Some of the color pages could have been a little better, but like when I say color pages, I mean in monochrome. They seem a bit blocky or something. But in general, the paper quality is pretty good. So Dark Horse, I'm hoping in their upcoming omnibus releases of Astro Boy, these editions that I'm showing you are out of print now, but they will be re-releasing Astro Boy in omnibus editions. I'm hoping that they'll make it a little bigger, and maybe they'll clean up the translation. So, overall, Astro Boy, what are my opinions on it? I will say that overall, probably my third least favourite of Osamu Tezuka's works, ahead of Dororo and Atom Cat, but probably behind everything else. But that shouldn't be taken as, you know, on every story. Basically, you know, there's stories that I didn't care for, and there were some stories that I really did feel were really, really interesting and good. So it'll be up to people's opinion. Like, this is a series that lots of people are going to have different opinions on each story. So overall, I would definitely recommend checking it out if you are a Tezuka fan in particular, or if you want to see, you know, the creation of the manga medium, because Astro Boy is definitely a highly, highly influential work on the manga medium. But, you know, it's not an amazing work from Osamu Tezuka in general. So, yeah, that's my basic opinion on Astro Boy. So, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.